Welcome to the Cracking the Growth Code podcast, where we explore practical growth and leadership insights to take you and your organization to the next level. I'm your host, Matt Zembruski, and I'm pleased to have as my guest today, Rod Senra.
Thanks for having me, Matt.
Pleasure to have you here, Rod. And just to give a quick intro, and then I'll ask you to expand upon it a little bit. I asked Rod sort of his background so I could introduce him properly here. And he's currently Vice President of Engineering for LoadSmart, responsible for the data platforms and AI initiatives there. He's passionate about computer science, and his background is computer engineering and data science. Rod, so happy to have you here on the show. Can't wait to get into it.
Same. Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
So to get things started and to introduce you and your company a little bit more to our audience and our listeners, can you just briefly introduce your company, your role there, sort of like what gets you out of bed in the morning and what you're passionate about right now?
Absolutely. LoadSmart's definition is a mouthful because we are a logistics solution provider, but we are acting on multiple interfaces. So we're solving problems in brokerage, we're solving problems in freight procurement, in dock scheduling, in managed transportation, in network optimization. So we are in everywhere in that space. We are still a startup. I was hired 2 years ago as director of the data platforms. That meant data engineering, data enablement, and 2 AI teams, one for pricing and one for recommendation systems. And I was recently promoted to VP of engineering. And now I'm also in charge of 2 other squads, one for dock scheduling, OpenDock, and another one for called NavTrack, which is a new technology for gate management and computer vision processing to monitor the ins and outs in facilities.
Wow, that is fantastic. There's so much in there, and there's so much for me to unpack.
Oh, it's fun.
That's really exciting. I have a little bit of a background working with a lot of systems integration partners back in the day and things like that. So it just my mind's already going in a lot of directions with all the APIs and interfaces and everything we're talking about for. So let's talk about the clearly you have a strong technology background, but you're growing your company. You know, it's a startup, small company, and let's talk about the people side of it. On the leadership side, people are near and dear to my heart, and I know they're important to grow any company. How do you define leadership when it comes to?
Wow, that is a big question, a very philosophical question, and I've been asking that question since I did the transition to a leadership role that's more pronounced on people management than engineering per se. So I think there are perhaps different types of leaders, and we will steer different definitions of leadership. For example, I see the leader with a vision, the ones that knows where to take the company. For example, Steve Jobs, I think it's a good example. I think there's another kind of leader that is the leader that keeps the people together, that inspires loyalty. For example, I think Ernest Shackleton in the Endurance, when like in the 1800s, they got stuck in ice and everybody survived in the most desperate conditions. So for me, that is an inspiring example of the people leader, that it's about loyalty, about like transmitting a feeling. And nowadays, LoadSmart went through 2 rounds of layoffs because of the conditions in the freight market. And a lot of the role was retention of people and being inspiring them in not only in the vision, but in the togetherness. So that is another aspect. I think another aspect of the leader, sometimes it's the leader itself has some charisma, and that charisma makes you want to like follow that person. I think perhaps Gandhi or Jesus or other like iconic figures. Steve Jobs also works, but depending on the moments of his career, there was like repulsion some moments and attraction in others. But I would say these 3 aspects are some types of leaders in the very loaded question of what is leadership.
That's a fantastic answer, and wow! You did such a great job there with sharing all the examples of the different types of leadership, and you also brought up something which is a typical for the times today, but oftentimes wouldn't be addressed in this podcast, and that is how do you keep the team engaged as you're going through layoffs, right? With multiple rounds of layoffs being hit in your industry, hitting a lot of industries, especially in technology over the last 18 months plus. So I think that's fascinating that you brought that up, because it's like, how do you retain the strong people with the company and keep them motivated and engaged, right, and so forth? So can you elaborate a little bit more on that?
Of course.
Some of how you did it and you navigated that path at LoadSmart over the last couple of years?
Absolutely. And now I'm speaking my personal strategy, not the company strategy as a whole, because it's somewhat a very personal question. And I do believe different leaders within LoadSmart will have different answers to that. So I want to make that really clear. So my personal strategy is focus on the people beyond the frontier of the current company. So when I engage with like my reports and my peers, I'm establishing a relationship like forever. And in that sense, I try to do what's best for them. And sometimes that means stay with LoadSmart because we are transparent. We give them space. We give them autonomy. We give them respect. We try to balance what is needed by the company and what they actually need. So we try to balance that at all times. And there are other times that there's not a fit. And then perhaps we try to help them reposition themselves in the market. Not because they are not wanted by LoadSmart, but perhaps they have better options out there. So that kind of honesty and transparency creates a kind of loyalty that people really resonate with. That's my strategy.
I love that. I love the way you said it. You put people at the center of everything, and that people first mindset and strategy. Strategy is the wrong word, but putting people first from your heart authentically, and then doing what's right for the individual. I love the way you describe that, because it's so important. And what's right might be they get an opportunity outside your company, outside your organization, right? And helping them.
And sometimes that means business for the company, because they reposition in another company and they put on a good word for where they were previously and that generates businesses.
That's fantastic. And so let's talk about sometimes there's layoffs, there's downsizing, sometimes there's hiring, right? You need to bring people in, and we've been in this downsizing, hiring freeze swing in a lot of tech, right, the space for the last 18 to 24 months. But there's still hiring happening in there, right? It's small, it's few and far between.
For sure.
And I know that LoadSmart, is like other companies, you're not always going in one direction. You're always, you're right, moving ebbs and flows in the market. So from a hiring perspective, when you want someone to join your team and you're interviewing them for the first time, what are the top 3 attributes that you're looking for in a candidate?
Right. That's a very interesting question. So again, this will be like a very personal response, not like LoadSmart response for hiring. I do, after many years, I have developed my own script for interviewing. So usually those interviews kind of vary from 30 minutes to 45 minutes or an hour. I try to split those interviews into 3 segments. So the first segment, I go over the candidate's profile. So their CV or their profile on LinkedIn, the place that they worked for, I try to understand reasons for them to stay in places they stayed that long, reasons for them to leave in places that they left after a brief period of time. And that is like the first thing that I'm observing is consistency. So that's the first segment. The second stage on the interview, I try to use the candidate's past experience, and I try to anchor my more generic or technical questions on those experiences. And that is like the second thing, the content and the match between what I am looking for and that person. Because sometimes they have like a great candidate, and maybe they are like too great. They will feel like frustrated in the position that I have to offer to them. Or the opposite, or it's beyond the challenge. They are not yet evolved enough for what we're looking for, or they won't be able to deliver in the time frame that you're expecting. So it's really about balance. So that is the second thing, the content and the match between the candidate and the opportunity. And the third thing, at the third stage of the interview, I flip roles, and then they interview me. So I always reserve some time for them to interview me, to interview the company. I tell them, you need to do a good job interviewing the company as well, because nobody will do that for you. And at that point, I'm observing as well how much time they invested in terms of either studying me, the interviewer, or studying LoadSmart, the target company, or the job position, or whatever. And then I'm measuring curiosity, proactivity. So these would be not exactly three, but the three stages of my interview are really clear. And I observe these things in those three stages.
I love that. I love that. And that's a beautiful way to think about it. And I can see how it's evolved over time. It's very important. And you're right, it is very personal. You've referenced that a couple of times, and it is a very personal thing. It doesn't always represent
very subjective.
Yeah, it's very subjective. And what I think, I want to call out a piece of your LinkedIn profile, which I was very impressed with. You talked about Taoism briefly, and you talked about three words that describe you. And I thought about this, and I said, wow, that's really, really smart to put like three words. He says, in your LinkedIn profile, to share with everybody, you said nobody can be summed up in three words, but there's three words that resonate highly with you and your character and what you bring to the table. And I'll share them with the audience. It's curiosity, all three C words: curiosity, conviviality, and confidence.
Yes.
And I think the way that you described your interview style with the three stages, you're actually covering those areas as well for the candidates.
We do have like something called a confirmation bias, and we have a bias to similarity. So we try to we react positively to what is the same, right? So in that sense, I try always to be very cognizant of all those bias when I go in the quality of an interviewer. But there is a very generic kind of framework that I believe makes sense for any company, for people to demonstrate those things. So I try to look for them in other people as well. And I try to train myself to be good at those dimensions, if you will.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And dimension's a good word too, because a lot of aspects, I'm passionate about the soft skills related to leadership and related to candidates, the things that you can't see on the resume easily, right? You can sort of read between the lines and get some ideas and some guesses, but until you're in the interview, it's tough to really pull that out. And so a question I have for you is, what is one of your favorite questions that you pull out of your back pocket when you're interviewing somebody for the first time and you want to assess some of the stuff that you can't see on their resume, like one of their soft skills?
I love that question. So I do have an interesting answer for this one, but a short explanation. So when I was a student, sometimes I was very frustrated because in a test, in an evaluation, sometimes the teacher didn't ask something that I studied deeply. So often when it was discursive, I used the back pages of the tests, just writing down other stuff that I knew and they never asked about. Later, I became a teacher for undergraduate course, and I saw how hard it was to design an evaluation that was cost effective for the teacher to correct and also to capture the retention of knowledge by the students. It's super hard. And in the interview, we have the same problem, which is in a short amount of time, we're trying to sum up a career of like many years sometimes, right? So every time at the end of the interview, I give the candidates one specific question, which is, what is the question that I did not do, but you came prepared to answer? So that is like my favorite question, because I give one last chance for the candidate to display awesomeness and cover for my gap in terms of probing the domain space and capturing something that was important. At least the candidate considered important, prepared themselves to answer. and I didn't give the opportunity. So that is my safeguard to guarantee fairness in the interviewing process.
That's a beautiful answer. Wow, there's so many unique unique aspects to your interview style and your leadership style, Rod. I'm really glad we're having this discussion on the podcast. This is exciting. I want to talk about the company and either the company or the industry, which one you want to go into. I know logistics is a big space.
Right.
But what do you think is, and there's a lot of things moving like crazy in technology today with AI and machine learning.
Right.
And I know
Right.
in your world, data science, it's moving
Right.
so fast. You know, what do you see as the biggest challenge facing either your company or the industry today? Like, does it have to do with processes or people or hiring or what is it?
Well, it's hard to trim down to like a single thing. I will mention perhaps a couple, not to take too much time of the interview as a whole. But one of the things, it's the value of data. So I see a very concrete and reasonable demand from leadership, which is, what is the value of this? So we're doing a project. What is the business value? What's the ROI? How do we measure those kind of things? Perfect. And for some things, it's easier than others, especially when you're talking about the data space and you have data pipelines and you're producing things that go from out of the digital world into the mind of people and then back into the business. Because the transition from the digital to the wetware of like our neurons, that's where our monitoring, our observability gets lost. And then we cannot measure directly the value anymore, because we could have provided a great insight for somebody and they can have like solved a deep problem of the company, but we cannot measure that. So that is for me a very hard problem. For example, people were asking me prior to the layoffs, oh, what is the value of like the BI division? What is the value of dashboards? What is the value of this report? What is the value of data engineering pipelines, and etc.? And I said, it's simple. I turn it off and we measure the screens. So, and then we know it's just about volume. So that was like one way to introduce the human elements in the equation, so we can get the input that we need to like put a cost in there. So I'm exploring a bunch of things in that space because I think it's a recurring question. I was watching other podcasts to educate myself on the aspect, but I see it's not just me having difficulty. Like in a CGO Matters podcast, that was a main topic. How do you measure the value of data? So I say, okay, it's hard for everybody. So I would say this would be one thing. The other thing right now, it's a very common, very popular, very hyped question, which is, how do we include AI into the business? And we elicit, so it's a different kind of thing. It's similar, tangent, but different, because right now AI is very, very hyped. And in the cycle of hype, people try to put it everywhere. And I'm trying to educate the rest of the leadership, as well as some of like my peers, in us together finding reasonable ways, anchored in like business real reasons, to explore those opportunities that are not just the hype itself. So I would say this would be the other thing that is very anchored into all of the business that I see digital business right now.
That makes a lot of sense. And your first point about value and demonstrating value and measuring value is such a big one out there and across all industries. I've done a lot of work in the agile space with project management and agile coaching and leadership and so forth. And that's a big question that companies, leaders, product owners, product managers, it's challenging. It's like, how do you demonstrate the value that you delivered? Like, did you change somebody's life? Did you improve a company? Did you save them money? Did you make it easier? Whatever. So demonstrating value is challenging. And what you shared on the data side, that's fascinating. That's fascinating. Let's talk about the importance of culture. We talked about leadership and a number of aspects of sort of building the right people and finding the right people for your teams and growing and so forth. What do you think is working well? And this could be something that you personally brought to the table over the last couple of years, or you could describe something. It doesn't have to relate to your current company if you don't have a good example, but just from a corporate culture today, companies are growing, they're shrinking, they're growing, they're shrinking. There's a lot of things happening in the marketplace today.
Right.
What do you think your organization is doing well right now in terms of its corporate culture?
Perfect. And I have a good example from LoadSmart, and it is transparency. So I believe right now, I think it was ever true, but right now, perhaps more than ever, it's a moment that people are thirst for transparency. And this is one of my personal retention factors at LoadSmart, which is a company that goes through difficulties for sure, but it's really very transparent. So we have in our all hands meetings, the CEO gets there and then shows like, what is our plan in details? What is like our financial situation? What he's going to tell the board, what the board has told him to do. So like everybody, it's on the same boat, and you don't see that very often. There are some times that, especially in the management hierarchies, some managers that are not hands-on, the only thing that they do is basically control the disclosure of information, routing of information. Mm-hmm. And then transparency feels like disempowering them. Mm-hmm. But on the contrary, my personal experience is that transparency leads to loyalty, to trust, to engagement. So it leads to empowerment of managers. And I'm super happy with the transparency culture at LoadSmart today.
That is fantastic. It reminds me of Jeff Sutherland, who is one of the original founders or creators of Scrum back in the early days of the Agile movement. Brilliant individual. He's actually in my area, in the Boston area. I've seen him a few different times at events, but he talks about the concept of radical transparency, which is exactly what you just shared.
Right. Yeah.
Like, let's share everything. Let's do open book. Let's not just edit and filter information, give it to different levels of the company. Let's let everybody know what's going on, because that's, like you said, very empowering, builds a culture of trust, and it makes people, it helps the unlock the potential knowledge workers and potential that people have as humans in the corporate culture to really start to contribute. They can say, well, why aren't our numbers a little bit better over here? Maybe if we do something here, that can improve these sales, that can improve our profits, that can improve our cost metrics, etc. So I like that.
And one more thing, Matt, prior to coming to like the software industry, I came from other communities as well, academia and the open source. And in both, they have many similarities. And transparency was one of them. It was like one tenet, a fundamental principle. And when I apply that into the industry, it works really well. So, yeah.
I like that. I like that. Well, as we wrap things up, Rod, what would be your top 3 tips to share for leaders today? They could be a new leader who's just emerging and they want to really grow their career as a leader in a company, or they could be someone who's been around for a few decades and they want to reinvent themselves to really bring out their best. What would be your top 3 tips for leaders today?
Right. So I would say transparency, the first one we already talked about, and it saves us a little bit of time. The second one would be proactivity. So there are times that you are afraid to take action. Don't be afraid to make mistakes. Simply apologize. In the Python community, we have a saying that it's easier to ask forgiveness than permission. So sometimes simply go there and do something. And the third one will be humility. So I was listening to, I was listening because it was an audiobook, which was Good to Great by Jim Collins. And he was identifying aspects for big companies. And one of them was the humility from like the leaders that were very focused on the betterment of the company itself, not on themselves. And I believe humility have these two aspects. First, focusing not on yourself, on the echo more than the ego, and then giving a little bit of space for others as well. So that is something that I've been training myself, because it's a dialectical interaction with the proactivity. There are times that by being very proactive, you are inhibiting other people to be proactive as well. So you need to have some balance there to allow space for others to shine as well. And as a leader, it's more relevant for you to be your own judge for when to act in one way or the other.
Well said. Well said. Thank you very much, Rod, for sharing all this and for your time.
My pleasure, Matt.
And energy today. Really, really enjoyed our conversation, and I'm sure our audience is going to get a lot from it as well. Thank you so much.
I hope so.